certain that everything is certainly fine. Morning in Ponyville shimmers, morning in Ponyville shines, and I know for absolute certain that everything will die.
Hello, my viewers and subscribers. I am TorridPasta999, your online horror host whom you go to find out what lives and what gets sent straight to hell. Imagine you're all wondering why I was completely absent from last year's Nightmare Night. The short answer, I had a lot of things I needed to deal with. Ghosts, vampires, werewolves, and that freeloading changeling in the garage that keeps trying to stake me! Screw you, bad boy! Now screw you, bug boy! With a hot curling iron and a can of Raid! Anyway, seeing as how you were all sadly deprived of a proper night of Nightmare Frights last year, this year I've got something special for all of you. A Torrid Pasta double feature! 2 videos back to back, seeing how a classic internet ghost story compares with a fan's horror story of the modern day. And we start this double feature with one of the classics of internet spooky tales. For those of you who might be wondering, a creepypasta is an evolution of the term copypasta, itself a derivative of the term copy and paste, where people online would copy whole speeches and repost them elsewhere across the internet, whether or not they were the original authors. So basically, that you can only understand Rick and Morty if you have a genius level IQ speech you sometimes see in defense of that stupid show, that's a copypasta. Well, creepypastas are like that, only they're internet ghost stories spread around with unknown authors that add to the mysterious creepy factor. Not all of them are good. Many about cartoons just boil down to theories that cartoon characters are dead and in hell the entire time, or are based off of actual dead children in real life. Lazy stuff like that. And it's still debated whether or not Squidward's suicide is actually any good. Personally, I think his suicide was weak. But one creepypasta I very much remember from years back is a true classic. A story that shook my little black heart and found a cozy places in the dark recesses of my memories. A creepypasta called Abandoned by Disney. Written by user Slimebeast, Abandoned by Disney follows an unnamed protagonist as he tells the story of investigating an old, abandoned Disney resort and the horrors he found there. The story takes its inspiration from a real-life cruise resort, Treasure Island, a place in Baker's Bay in the Bahamas that Disney sunk millions of dollars into, 30 million to be precise, and upsetting tons of local people, only to completely abandon the resort once they discovered there wasn't an optimal place to park their cruise ships. The reason given was shallow waters, I believe, something they apparently forgot to check before even approving the resort. It's Disney for you. Effectively leaving the entire resort to rot over time and become a ghost town, as well as leaving it to the angry locals who have since completely trashed the place, smashing interiors, shattering every toilet on the island, and stealing the inner workings out of not just the jet skis, but even the paddle boats. But to be fair, the locals probably weren't happy that Disney had also apparently released their entire aquarium attraction into the wild, and that included their Shark Tank. Many would consider Treasure Island to be just one of those urban legends, but a blogger from the blog site iMockery actually tracked down the location and went there himself, photographing his journey while suitably delivering a bevy of quips in the blog post to describe the sorry and at times bizarre state of the abandoned resort. Even if you aren't interested in the creepypasta, I do recommend you seek out the iMockery blog, as it is a very fun read, both for the real-life absurdity and for the author's sharp wit from the classic internet days. Oh, and I hope you like coconuts, 'cause there's a lot of those too. Abandoned by Disney is specifically based off of this blog post, with our intrepid protagonist himself being a blogger, and directly, in canon, inspired by the Treasure Island blog to seek out an abandoned Disney resort and document his findings himself. His location of choice is the fictional resort known as Mowgli's Palace, set in the beachside city of Emerald Isle, North Carolina. While it has a similar story to Treasure Island, Mowgli's Palace is a lot more controversial, as apparently Disney compelled the local government to screw dozens, if not hundreds, of people out of their land and property by claiming eminent domain, which the government then sold to Disney. According to this story, the local government even went so far as to claim it was all for some non-existent highway, though of course everyone knew what it was actually for. Much of this story is fairly mundane stuff. The blogger describing his familiarity with the fictional resort, his process of researching and getting there, and of course his exploration of the run-down, vandalized location. This may not seem like much of a horror story. Oh sure, the rundown resort is kind of creepy, and at one point the author describes hearing phantom voices, but can't find the source. And water seems to be constantly running, even when it logically should have stopped years ago. All throughout the resort, he keeps finding crudely made signs that all say abandoned by Disney, but still, for the most part, it's more amusing and engaging than it is terrifying. But that's what really makes the actual horror work, as it's saved entirely for the final stretch, when our protagonist finds a locked basement hangout where the cast members would go in their off time. Here, he finds a treasure trove of abandoned items that hadn't been swiped by locals and looters, though a lot of it has sustained so much environmental damage that some of it even disintegrates in his hands. Venturing further and further back, he at last comes to the final room, finding a set of Disney character costumes hanging up around the room, as well as a Mickey Mouse costume with bizarrely inverted colors, just lying down on the floor. As our protagonist removes one of the headpieces of a Donald Duck costume to get a better picture of it, something falls out of it and shatters onto the floor, and he is horrified to discover the remains of a human skull at his feet. He quickly prepares to leave, only to look back and discovers that the inverted Mickey Mouse is somehow standing up. Though he tries to take a picture of it, his camera is seemingly corrupted by an unknown force, and then just dies on him. Finally, as he is petrified with fear, the Mickey costume asks if he wants to see its head come off, and then proceeds to awkwardly rip it right off, revealing thick, yellow fluid that may very well be this thing's blood. At last motivated to flee for his life, the protagonist sees one final message as he makes his exit. Etched into the stone above the doorway of the final room are the words, "Abandoned by God." Now, what makes this creepypasta truly effective is really what makes any good horror work, and that's immersion. By taking us through the mundane, if otherwise absurd, journey of a simple blogger and his mission to discover what remains of an abandoned resort, we are effectively taken on the journey ourselves, watching along with him as he makes all these small discoveries. By the time the real horror finally starts, we're already so invested in his journey that we can't help but be just as taken aback as he is once the true scary stuff gets underway. Effectively having made us forget that this is a horror story, and then turning around and shocking us with the horrific reveal that ties it all together, yet still leaves just enough mysteriously unanswered. It's a satisfyingly chilling experience that I obviously highly recommend. However, this isn't where the story ends. There are actually 4 parts to the Abandoned by Disney story, with the second effectively working as a prequel, yet with a very unique twist to it. A Few Suggestions is kind of a story, told entirely through what's written on a series of suggestion cards, which give us a more insightful, if also very confusing, view into what happened at Mowgli's palace before it mysteriously shut down. Right off the bat, I have to say that A Few Suggestions really isn't as creepy as Abandoned by Disney. In fact, I dare say it's more funny at times than it is chilling. Many of the suggestions, especially at first, are fairly mundane things. And that's actually a good thing, as it lends a bit more believability to the experience, thus enhances the immersion. Making it even better is that the repeats of suggestions start to get more and more desperate or bizarre, creating a sense of growing madness. Sadly, that's really the best that can be said, as all the spooky stuff just doesn't translate as well. Maybe it's the format of the story, or maybe it's the wording, but it never reaches the fear point of the previous story, or really even comes close to it. The recurring elements we have for the story are vandalism at the South Gate, someone stealing suggestion cards, an unnamed employee going on about a fellow employee named Frank, whom he seems to have a real problem with, and one cast member seemingly going insane inside one of the suits. The last two are the most noteworthy, as the unnamed employee heavily implies he killed Frank and then shoved his body into a toilet, while the cast member spirals further and further into insanity, the last suggestion card having him say that he's been hanging costumes with people in them on hooks, and that there is no hook left for him, revealing that one of the employees was really the inverted Mickey costume. Perhaps once a person, but he has become fused with his suit. I won't say this story is overall bad, just that it isn't as scary as maybe it could have been, or at least that the format doesn't allow for much immersion as the previous story. The idea to tell a story through just suggestion cards is a really fun idea, as the disconnected information paints an incomplete picture and forces the reader to piece together the puzzle, which tends to be great when we finally come to a terrifying realization, kind of like how in the initial Five Nights at Freddy's game, where you're only ever indirectly told the backstory of what happened at the pizzeria and why the animatronics seemingly want to kill you, with you having to piece together clues you find throughout the restaurant, all while trying to avoid getting caught by the vicious machines. Yet where I don't think a few suggestions succeeds is in the tension itself. We just don't have enough of a protagonist or even really a story to get invested in before the terrifying twists reveal themselves. Sure, we have Frank's killer becoming more and more unhinged, but we really know next to nothing about this guy, or even Frank, beyond the fact that he somehow cheats at solitaire and Sudoku. And as for the inverted Mickey costume, we really don't get to know much about him beyond the sudden bizarre things he goes through, all related to being a cast member. Even in the Thomas and Friends CreepyPasta videos, Shed 17 and Project G1, we still have a character to follow in the form of the interviewee, as we get the story mostly from his perspective. And when the final terrifying twist happens to him, it hits much harder, as we've been following his own journey and have gotten at least a little invested in him. Regardless, I would still recommend a few suggestions, as it is still a fun and intriguing story with a unique format. Rome Zero is the first proper sequel to Abandoned by Disney, taking place a couple of years after the first story, as it follows the blogger in his quest to investigate even more of the shady, dark practices of the Walt Disney Corporation. This time, our blogging protagonist tells of information he uncovered after his ill-fated trip to Mowgli's palace, that ever since he's become certain that Disney has been trying to silence him, with his own story apparently having been taken down in quite a few places, though others have mirrored it and kept it alive, and he is even seeing Mickey Mouse three-circle silhouettes everywhere. At one point he comes across a chalk outline like at a crime scene, with the word retract close to it. Spurned by this, our protagonist has been looking into incidents at other Disney resorts, knowing they're covering something massive up, and it looks like it's more than just at Mowgli's palace, citing emails from employees who have worked at the Disney parks, exposing some of the darker occurrences that go on behind the scenes, and even a few genuinely dark and twisted revelations. Some of what's revealed is fairly mundane stuff, especially by today's standards, like the utilidors or utility corridors beneath the parks, secret apartments for the employees, as well as other establishments for employees who practically live at the parks anyway, even a nightclub where, quote-unquote, anything goes. But the proper dark stuff begins with the Gascots, strange phantoms who briefly appear throughout the parks, wearing uncanny gas masks with Mickey Mouse character faces painted on them. Little else is known about them, and naturally there seem to be almost no reports of any such people anywhere. At least, not officially. The weirdness increases with a lifeguard revealing his experience with a water slide that seems to have a bizarre effect on kids, most of whom seem to come out the other end fine, but don't seem quite right on further inspection, and never go on the slide again. Particularly, one obese kid seemingly disappears on the slide and doesn't come out until later, clearly disturbed and mumbling about the blank faces. Another employee describes a policy of not letting cast members off, even if they die. Apparently, if a cast member dies inside a suit while on duty, it's the responsibility of another to prop that one up and make it look like the person is still alive, before medical staff can cart off the corpse in secret, so as not to ruin the immersion. Even if that means innocent patrons end up taking happy pictures of themselves with dead employees. But the final story is where things really get freaky. Relayed from a demolitions and construction worker who tales of a specific area in Disney World marked "Do Not Dig," despite how much of a hindrance and waste of space it is to just be left alone. The worker's investigation of the area only finds a blank supermarket's expanse of concrete with seemingly nothing done with it. And it is after this when the aforementioned gas scouts make a return, the worker seeing quite a bit more of them, noting condensation on the eyeglasses that seem impossible to see through. This sparks the worker to investigate further, finally finding someone who worked at the park decades before and can actually tell him what happened. The woman, Ida, then tells him that the area is called Room Zero, a massive bomb shelter that has since been buried beneath the concrete. Ida tells that one day an air raid siren went off when the park was full and hundreds of patrons went into the shelter. Things were already tense at first, but soon escalated into full-blown pandemonium, made infinitely worse when the shelter's lights went out. Some staff and patrons had had enough and fled the shelter, only to discover that the entire thing was a false alarm, that there was no air raid, and that the park above was fine. Venturing back down to the shelter, Ida and the others discover only pitch blackness and an eerie silence, instead of the horrific chaos and panic they had left. Being the only one brave enough to investigate, Ida approached the doors, only to be met with a mysterious, raspy voice telling her to shut the doors, as they were letting out the cold. Ida described that the shelter was immediately buried after that, with even the air vents and generators pulled up and everything covered in concrete. Room Zero ends somewhat abruptly after Ida's story, with the blogger revealing she supposedly accidentally fell out of bed and died, the final line of the story citing a line from the local paper that Ida's room was covered with Mickey Mouse silhouettes. Unfortunately, this story is where the overall plot of the CreepyPasta series starts to get a little lost. I remember starting to read this one way back after I first read Abandoned by Disney, but quickly dropped this story when the author opened by going on about how he was convinced Disney was watching him as he was seeing Mickey Mouse silhouettes everywhere. But eventually, when I revisited the story, I felt compelled to read the entire series, and, well, my initial misgivings turned out to not be unfounded. Where Room Zero fails is largely in how it is told. The original story was an immersive blog post-styled story that followed a single protagonist's journey through a seemingly mundane place that suddenly pivoted towards horror at the very end. Its sequel, by contrast, has us reading his own accounts of other people's accounts, which I feel is a mistake, as it creates more degrees of separation and thus severely weakens the immersion. Not helping is what kind of accounts these third parties give, immediately delving into supernatural occurrences, yet are the kind of occurrences that just aren't satisfying, with third party describing seeing bizarre things, but little to nothing really coming of them. And sure, the dead cast member policy is sincerely dark and twisted, yet I find it to be hampered by how brief it is and how little of an effect it really has on basically anything else in the entire story. The placement of the stories doesn't do this sequel any favors either, starting off with the Gascots immediately revealing a spooky supernatural presence, thus leaving little if any room for a proper twist later on. Even the reveal of nothing coming from that story effectively dampens the tension even more. While the waterslide story that follows is kind of creepy, it also has the same problem, with little coming from it and it being such a low-tension story. The brief excerpt of the cast member revealing what happens if cast members die on the job is sufficiently dark and twisted for the series, but it just isn't enough to pick the momentum back up. As previously said, it's too brief and inconsequential. But the worst is definitely the janitor story, as it is by far the most mundane and unsurprising account given in the story, revealing the seedier side of the staff where patrons don't see. However, the problem isn't actually material per se, as it is rather amusing if nothing else, especially since some of the information given is actually true. There are utility corridors beneath the parks, and Disney did have the odd nightclub, and no doubt some of the smoke from the attractions likely burned remains of trash that gets left in the utilidors. Really, its placement in the sequel is what makes it the worst, being the second to last story. It follows two supernatural accounts and the one account of a policy involving corpses. Really, it should have been the account the story opened with, starting out with a dark but believable account of what goes on at the Disney parks behind the scenes, then gradually revealing more and more dark supernatural elements to the accounts that follow it. The only story within this sort of anthology that really works is the titular Room Zero, as it's the only one that reads like a proper story, and thus it has the most immersion. Honestly, I feel that Room Zero really should have been its own single standalone story with merely an implied connection to Abandoned by Disney, leaving readers to wonder what the connection really is. That said though, while it does come close to the same fear factor as the first story, it still doesn't quite hit the mark. But I attribute that to it just being shorter, and that as a result, it just doesn't have enough time to fully immerse you into it. Another issue I have with the sequel is that it takes us away from the isolated location of Mowgli's palace, since horror tends to work better in isolated locations, where it's much easier to make the audience feel alone and trapped to something terrible. But with Room Zero, the horror is spread out to multiple parks, thus weakening the feeling of isolation, and coupled with accounts mostly being much weaker in terms of scare, it really waters down the scary effect that Slime Beast was likely going for. Not helping is the opening either, where the author immediately tries to unnerve us with the blogger's paranoia about being followed to an almost supernatural degree, with the silhouettes appearing everywhere. To me, this opening always felt too try hard, like it was almost too easy a thing to go for, to the point where it seemed unbelievable, unlike the first story, where realism made the immersion so much greater, and that's why I initially just dropped this story years ago. The silhouettes appearing everywhere just took me immediately out of the story. Unfortunately, I can't really recommend Room Zero, as well it does have a nice, creepy little story of a horrific incident from decades ago. The rest of the sequel just drags the whole thing down and isn't that fun to read, nor really is it that scary. The final installment in this series is Corruptus, following the final account of our protagonist as he is at his wit's end after Disney has apparently systematically been ruining his life, getting his library card revoked, cancelling his ISP, and even having goons in suits follow him around, scribbling notes of pure nonsense, supposedly just to drive him crazy, with the speculation that someone using his name will commit a crime in order to discredit him. Much of the fourth installment details what he's been up to and what he's discovered, eventually focusing on a single email he managed to receive with an attached document about something called a corruptus. The document is very vague as to what a corruptus actually is, only listing off various examples that are known to exist in various officially licensed Disney parks and attractions, including Mowgli's Palace, with the example listed as inverted character, cluing us into what the inverted Mickey really is. The rest of this story following the document is pretty much just the blogger speculating as to what a corruptus really is, ultimately concluding that Disney somehow is utilizing some kind of supernatural eldritch force to try and bring their products to life, only for the process to go wrong and enigmatic monsters being born as a result instead, possibly due to people's poor interactions with the parks influencing the corruptuses and causing them to become horrific. The author concludes his tale by saying Disney doesn't want this information getting out, the true depths of their corrupted misdeeds, and wishing readers good luck. Sadly, this final installment of the series doesn't do anything to pick it back up. Room Zero had a primary problem of coming off more like a lore fic than an actual story. Basically, an excuse to rattle off backstory and trivia, rather than to tell an actual story. And Corrupt, this is unfortunately just more of that, but with even less story and an arguably worse execution. Not just because the paranoid "Disney is trying to silence me and they can't be stopped" thing is a very tired cliche in fiction and really only scary in real life, if I can be honest, but also because the final bits of lore and trivia that are meant to explain it all just doesn't quite work out. Easily the worst part of the story is the end, where the blogger speculations feel like monumental leaps in logic, drawing conclusions from almost nothing, with very little writing to actually explain to us how he even reached that conclusion. Which makes the final chapter in this series feel very rushed. Now, that's not to say it doesn't tie everything together, because for the most part it does. I had actually forgotten about the part of the first story where Disney screwed tons of people out of their homes just to make a resort, and that does tie rather neatly in with the scummy, outright evil actions that the Disney Corporation takes in these stories. Following the initial one, and the Corruptus file does help to somewhat tie together the explanation. Even the speculation from the author does its job in explaining to us how it all works and how it all started. But the real problem for me is more so in the general concept and what direction the series took. For years after I read Abandoned by Disney, my own explanation for the horror that unfolded in the end was that Disney had unintentionally built Mowgli's palace on top of the entrance to hell itself, and the misfortunes and horrors experienced were the result of the pure evil and torment of hell seeping through the resort's foundations and infecting it. And once they realized what was happening, they up and abandoned the entire resort and buried all information on it, trying to keep the evil they'd accidentally unleashed from escaping even further, perhaps even too afraid to demolish it in case that accidentally opened the gates of hell completely. And sure, the scummy practice of Disney obtaining the land in the first place does seem to run counter to my explanation a bit, but I still think it works, as Disney might seem like an all-consuming evil corporation, but even they pale in comparison to the true depths of evil and horror that wait on the other side. I fully admit this is a preference thing, and it might even sound like I'm contradicting myself when I earlier said that a problem with Room Zero is how it isn't isolated like the first story was, when wouldn't the infinite horrors of hell be far more encompassing than an eldritch power affecting a few parks? Well, in some ways, maybe, but where I prefer my interpretation is that hell itself is more than just fire and brimstone. It is suffering and pure torment. And anyone with more life experience and imagination knows that suffering and torture involves more than just fire and pain. It involves fear, a terror within that never lets you rest, leaves you unable to enjoy whatever pleasures you have. Hell can just as easily be an eternally pitch-black, freezing cold void that you are forced to wander for eternity, or reliving a terrible nightmare, or even living a life where existence just doesn't make sense and you are constantly being driven mad. The possibilities are terrifyingly endless. And as such, when it comes to Mowgli's palace, manifestations of hell's essence take the form of the inverted Mickey, a thing that doesn't make sense, there to drive you to madness and agony. Honestly, this could serve as an explanation for the bones in the costumes. Poor souls unlucky enough to become trapped in hell's reach, hung up on hooks by the inverted Mickey where their souls are ripped from their bones and pulled into the realm of eternal torment, or even human sacrifices in a desperate final bid to appease the evil forces before finally everyone who survives is able to escape, and hope that no one will find this place and suffer its eternal torment. Well, outside the losers, of course. But hey, that's why the cast member room was locked. And honestly, the same explanation could even apply to the Room Zero incident, with a much darker twist being that hundreds of innocent patrons were actually sacrificed to hell itself in order to appease some unseen terrible entity. Personally, I just don't care for the easy explanation of Disney is just evil, as it's too black and white, and no matter how awful they are, there is some comfort to be found in taking the right side, and even the implication that by thwarting the evil company, then the problem will just sort itself out and go away. But with the morally gray situation, where a corrupt company accidentally unleashes something that even they are scared of, it waters down the moral contrast, as one might find himself forced to join with the lesser of two evils in order to oppose a much greater threat, breaking it all down to simple survival, which in itself can be even more terrifying than an all-consuming evil corporation, with said corporation being reduced to a terrified entity that is desperate for a way out, paling in comparison to the evil it awakened. And worse still, you can't stop the monster by killing the company, because once the company is destroyed, there might be nothing that can stand against the very monster that company unleashed. Of course, that's just me. Oh, and I have to mention this because otherwise it'll bother me for always and eternity. So, the TV Tropes page on this series talks about that ending with the protagonist realizing he's only made the problem worse by spreading this knowledge to everyone, thus making the corruptness more widespread and powerful, and that Disney was trying to keep the monster they created from getting worse by silencing it. This does not happen anywhere in the series. The final installment ends with the protagonist saying he was wrong, yes, but not about his approach, but in that he thought it was limited only to Mowgli's palace, when in reality, it expands so much further. No insight about Disney's morally complex place in this story, nor the consequences of his meddling, just finishing on a straightforward, Disney is evil, but we might finish them yet. I recommend TV Tropes adjust their articles on the fiction accordingly. Overall, I definitely recommend you give Abandoned by Disney a read, as it's a definite classic that still holds up to this day, and even give a few suggestions a read if you're interested. But I recommend you just skip Room Zero and Corruptus, as they're not as satisfying experiences. But this is a double feature, isn't it? Two videos, this delightfully dark nightmare night. So stay tuned for the next video, where we take a look at a horror story that I believe does everything Abandoned by Disney tried to, but does it perfectly. So until then, this is TorridPasta999, signing out for now and reminding you to not forget to shut the door, lest you let out the cold. Happy Nightmare Night!
Muffins!
You just cannot end my videos, end my Halloween videos without maniacal laughter like that. It would not be fun otherwise.